It was a quiet Sunday evening in Virginia Beach. Around 6 o'clock on March 6, 2022, a woman in a wheelchair was near a small pond in a residential community on Water Oak Road. The sun was starting to go down over the apartment buildings that surrounded the water. Cars sat in the parking lot. Kids' bikes leaned against fences. People were inside making dinner, watching television, going about the kind of ordinary evening that nobody ever remembers. The pond itself was not large. It sat in the middle of the apartment complex like a decorative afterthought, the kind of man-made lake that developers put in to raise property values. On most days, it was peaceful. Ducks floated on the surface. Residents walked past it on their way to the mailbox without giving it a second thought. Then the wheelchair rolled forward, whether it slipped on wet ground, whether the brakes failed, whether she simply lost control for a moment. We do not know the exact cause. What we know is that the chair went into the water, and the woman went with it. She was strapped in, belted to the seat. The very thing designed to keep her safe in the chair was now keeping her locked to something that was sinking, and the pond was pulling her under. She screamed for help, and the sound that came out of her was the kind of cry that Kevin Nizer, a United States Navy veteran who had lived in that community for 8 years, said he would never forget. He was standing on his balcony overlooking the water when he saw something dark in the pond and heard the screaming. He took a second look and saw a set of legs kicking above the surface. Then the cry for help hit him like a punch. Nizer described the sound as gut-wrenching, the kind of noise that grabs you by the chest and does not let go, the kind of sound you hear once and carry with you for the rest of your life. But Nizer was not the first person to react. Someone else had already started running. Bradley Glover was sitting inside his friend Terry Stokes' apartment just across from the pond. The two men were hanging out. Just a regular evening, nothing special. Then they looked out the window and saw the woman fall into the water. The wheelchair tipped forward and took her under in seconds. And before his brain had time to calculate the risk or weigh his options, Glover was out the door and running toward the pond. Think about what that means for a second. This is a man with no home, no steady income, no safety net, no insurance card in his wallet. He had not eaten a single meal that day, and he threw himself toward a pond to save a stranger who was sinking in a wheelchair. He got to the water's edge and went in after her. The pond was not deep, but it was deep enough. And the weight of a wheelchair in water with a person strapped into it is not something you can easily manage. The chair was pulling her down. The water was pulling her down. Gravity was pulling her down. And Glover was the only thing pulling in the other direction. He grabbed the chair and held it above the water. The woman was still strapped in, still panicking, still fighting to keep her head above the surface. Glover braced himself against the weight of the chair, the weight of the water, and the weight of a person who was terrified she was about to die. He planted his feet and held on. Meanwhile, Nizer ran inside to get dressed while his fiancée sprinted down to the lake. Other neighbors started emerging from their apartments. One woman who happened to have nursing experience came outside to help. Nizer grabbed blankets to keep the woman warm once she was pulled from the water. Together, this small group of strangers pulled the woman out of the pond and onto dry ground. Virginia Beach Emergency Medical Services were called, and the woman was transported to a local hospital. She survived. She was alive because a chain of people, led by a man with nothing to his name, refused to stand by and watch. Nizer later described the scene as one of the most beautiful displays of community he had ever witnessed. In a world that often feels fractured and disconnected, a group of neighbors who barely knew each other came together in the space of a few minutes to save a woman's life. A Navy veteran, a nurse, a fiancé who ran barefoot down a hill, a friend named Terry Stokes who saw what was happening and acted, and at the front of all of it, Bradley Glover. But it was Glover, the man who reached her first, the man who held the wheelchair above the waterline, until others arrived who left the deepest impression on everyone who witnessed what happened that evening. After the rescue, Glover did not celebrate. He did not pump his fist or wait for someone to pat him on the back. He collapsed on the sidewalk, completely spent. His body just gave out. He lay there on the concrete, soaking wet and shaking, a man who had given everything he had to someone he had never met. Kevin Nizer stood over him and felt something break open inside his chest. Here was a man that most people in that community had probably walked right past without ever making eye contact. A man the world had, in many ways, already decided to forget. And he had just saved a life. Nizer later told reporters that the moment changed him permanently. He said that for all the things he had witnessed during his time in the military, watching Glover collapse on that sidewalk after the rescue was one of the most life-changing moments he had ever experienced. He described Glover as someone who would give the only shirt off his back to a stranger without thinking twice. When reporters found Glover and asked him about what happened, his answer was short. He said it was just instinct. He said his whole body shut down completely, and he was just able to hold the wheelchair out of the water. He had never saved anyone before, and when asked why he did it, he said it was God's hands guiding him. He said Virginia Beach is strong, and that saving her was just one thing he could do. The story spread across local news stations and eventually picked up national attention. Neighbors who had never spoken to Glover before suddenly wanted to help him. Nizer publicly urged people to treat those experiencing homelessness with more compassion, pointing out that the community hero everyone was now celebrating had been invisible to them just 24 hours earlier. And this is where the story could end. The feel-good headline, the heartwarming rescue, the viral clip that makes you smile for 30 seconds before you scroll to the next thing. But if you stop here, you miss the bigger picture. Because Bradley Glover's story is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern that repeats itself over and over again. And the pattern reveals something uncomfortable about the way we see people who have nothing. And not every one of these stories ends the way you think it does. Some of them take turns that nobody saw coming, turns that force you to question everything you thought you knew about heroism, character, and what it means to be invisible in a society that only notices you when you do something extraordinary. Let's go back 5 years to May 22nd, 2017 in Manchester, England. It was a Monday night, and 22,000 people had just watched Ariana Grande perform at the Manchester Arena. The crowd was mostly young, teenagers, kids, parents who had brought their daughters to see their favorite singer. The concert had just ended, and people were filing toward the exits. At 10:31 that night, a suicide bomber named Salman Abedi detonated a homemade device in the arena foyer. 22 people were killed. Over 100 more were injured. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in Britain in more than a decade. In the chaos that followed, 2 homeless men became part of the story. Stephen Jones, a 35-year-old former bricklayer, had been sleeping rough near the arena that night. He had been homeless for over a year at that point, surviving on the streets of Manchester through cold nights and in different crowds. When the explosion went off, he thought at first it was fireworks. Then the screaming started. And then he realized what was actually happening. Jones ran toward the blast, not away from it. Inside the arena foyer, the scene was beyond anything he could have prepared for. He found children covered in blood, screaming and crying. Bolts and nails from the homemade bomb were embedded in their skin. Jones did what no training had taught him to do. He knelt down beside terrified kids and pulled metal nails out of their arms and faces with his bare hands. He tried to help an older woman with severe leg and head injuries, holding her and talking to her, but she died in his arms before medics could reach her. Jones later told ICTV News that the experience haunted him. He said he saw a lot of children with blood all over them. He said there were other homeless people nearby that night who also stayed and helped, people whose names never made the news. He said that just because he was homeless did not mean he did not have a heart. He said he would not have been able to live with himself if he had walked away. The media called him a hero. Crowdfunding campaigns raised thousands of pounds for him. He was eventually offered a job and a place to live. His story became one of the few bright spots in an otherwise devastating tragedy. But there was a second homeless man at the Manchester Arena that night, and his story took a very different turn. Chris Parker, 33, had been panhandling in the arena concourse when the bomb went off. He had been sleeping rough in Manchester for about a year, and the arena was one of his regular spots because large crowds meant more opportunities to beg for change. Like Jones, he was initially celebrated as a hero. He gave tearful interviews to the press, his voice shaking as he described how he had comforted a young girl who had lost her legs and wrapped her in a merchandise t-shirt. He said he had cradled a dying woman in her 60s who told him she had been there with her family. A fundraising page set up in his name raised nearly $40,000 in a single day. His estranged mother even reached out publicly, writing on the fundraising page that she had no idea her son was homeless, and that she was proud of him and wanted to reconnect. The whole country was moved. Here was a man who had nothing, risking everything, and it seemed to prove that goodness exists, even in the darkest moments. Then the CCTV footage surfaced. The security cameras inside the Manchester Arena had captured everything, and the footage told a completely different story from the one Parker had sold to the press. Instead of rushing to help victims, Parker was caught on video leaning over two injured people and going through their pockets and belongings while they lay bleeding on the ground. He took a woman's purse. He stole a phone from a teenage girl who was too injured to stop him. He took photographs of victims, apparently to share later. He used the chaos of a terrorist attack, a night when children were dying, as an opportunity to steal. The betrayal was staggering. People who had donated money felt sick. The media, which had put Parker on a pedestal, turned on him overnight. In January 2018, Chris Parker was sentenced to 4 years and 3 months in prison at Manchester Crown Court for theft. The hero narrative evaporated. The fundraising money was gone. The same outlets that had celebrated him now described his actions as despicable and shameless. And years later, Parker was back in prison again after violating the conditions of his release. The contrast between these two men is striking. Jones and Parker were both homeless. Both were at the same event on the same terrible night. One ran toward the suffering because he could not bear to walk away from it. The other saw suffering and decided to take what he could. And that contrast matters because it forces us to confront something we would rather not think about. Homeless people are not a category. They are individuals. Some are generous beyond anything most of us could imagine. Some are flawed in ways that are deeply ugly. They are, in other words, human beings with the same range of character and morality as everyone else. The homeless hero label, as comforting as it feels, actually reveals more about the people using it than the people it describes. Researchers and social commentators have pointed out that the media has created a specific trope around this idea. A person without a home does something brave. The story goes viral. People donate money and share the article, and then within a week, the attention fades. The underlying conditions that put that person on the street in the first place remain completely unchanged. Think about it. In just the last few years, headlines have celebrated homeless heroes who saved people at bus stops, rescued dogs from burning buildings, pulled crash victims from highways, and stopped children from being harmed in parks. Every single one of those stories generated a brief burst of public admiration, and in almost every case, the person returned to the exact same circumstances they were in before the cameras arrived. Bradley Glover is no different. After the Virginia Beach rescue, neighbors expressed their appreciation. Nizer asked people to send gift cards rather than cash. The story ran on local news for a few days. And then the news cycle moved on. The woman in the wheelchair survived and was taken to the hospital. Nizer hurt his knee running to help. And Glover, the man who made the whole rescue possible, was still a man without a home. This is not a criticism of the people who shared the story or donated money. Their impulse was genuine. The problem is bigger than any one person's generosity. The problem is that our society has built a system where someone can save a life on Sunday and still have no idea where they will sleep on Monday. If you are finding this helpful, subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, the ones that dig deeper than the headline. Now let's talk about what Kevin Nizer said, because his words stuck with a lot of people. He said, "You would never think to even say hi to Bradley Glover. You would just go about your business. You would not know that the man standing on the corner was a hero." And that is the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of these stories. We walk past people every single day, people who are invisible to us, people we have decided, consciously or not, are not worth our attention. And every once in a while, one of them does something so extraordinary that we are forced to actually see them. We celebrate them for a moment. We share their story. We feel good about humanity. But then what? There is a man in Minneapolis named Shane Drossard who was sleeping under a bridge in 2018 when he heard a massive splash in the Mississippi River at 2 in the morning. A woman was drowning. She had gone into the water intentionally. She was trying to end her life. Drossard ran to the riverbank, lowered himself down, and when the woman let go of his hand because she wanted to give up, he jumped in after her. He held on to her against the current while she told him she did not want to be alive anymore. He kept telling her she was beautiful and that she had a full life ahead of her. He saved her life that night, pulling her from the dark water of the Mississippi while the rest of the city slept. The next morning, Drossard went back to sleeping under his bridge. These stories keep happening, and every time we react the same way. We share, we comment, we feel something, and then we move on. The person who did the saving goes back to being invisible. The woman in the wheelchair in Virginia Beach is alive because a man who had nothing decided her life was worth more than his own safety. He did not calculate the risk. He did not check his bank account first. He did not wonder whether anyone would notice or whether it would make the news. He just went. Maybe the lesson here is not that homeless people can be heroes. We already know that. The lesson is that heroism does not require a home address. It does not require a resume or a credit score or a social media following. It requires exactly one thing, and that is the willingness to act when someone else is in danger. Bradley Glover had that. A lot of people with a lot more than him do not. Nizer said something else that is worth repeating. He said that after the rescue, after Glover collapsed on that sidewalk, soaking wet and shaking, he looked down at this man and realized something that shook him to his core. He realized that Glover had not hesitated for even a fraction of a second. There was no internal debate, no weighing of pros and cons, no wondering if someone else would handle it. The woman was drowning, and Glover moved. That was it. Nizer, a man who had served in the United States Navy, a man who had trained for emergencies and been through things that would break ordinary people, said that Bradley Glover's response was the purest example of courage he had ever witnessed in his life. And the man who showed that courage did not even have a meal waiting for him when it was over. The next time you pass someone on the street who looks like they have nothing, remember this story. Remember the pond on Water Oak Road in Virginia Beach. Remember the wheelchair sinking in the water. Remember the Bisa man who ran toward it when everyone else was still processing what was happening. Because heroism is not about what you have, it is about what you do when it counts. If this story changed the way you think about something even a little bit, subscribe and hit the bell so you see the next one. I have a video coming up about another story like this, one where the person society forgot ended up changing an entire community. That video is on screen now.